So I wanted to share a personal story that represents how I used pain to attain authoritative power, or the power of fire. Now, I've actually shared this story in the past, or this experience, this past pain, in an article for, I believe it was the American Tarot Association. So I will provide a link to that previously published article among the course materials in case you're interested in reading that and just getting a sense of the background. So I won't really get into the details, but we'll just provide the main gist of what happened. So this was back in college. I joined a social sorority when I was a freshman in college, and then I was hazed as well. So I was hazed to become initiated or to become a member of the sorority. And then in my sophomore year, due to various things that snowballed, which the article gets into, I was blackballed. Blackballed basically means I was kicked out of the sorority in my sophomore year. Now, at the time, I didn't have any authority. I didn't have any power. I was just this pipsqueak little 19-year-old, and I was up against all of these older sisters. It was the older sisters, the seniors, the super seniors of the organization, the chapter, that wanted me out. Anyway, so then we actually had to go before the national board. So there was a hearing to see whether or not the chapter sisters could properly kick me out of the organization, because at the time they didn't have enough evidence, or they didn't have any real reason for kicking me out. I didn't do anything that was, wrong. I didn't do anything against the sorority's constitution. So they had to present a legitimate reason for why I should be kicked out of the organization before the national board. The national board is, at the time, from my perspective, was comprised of all these really old sisters, which are now people my age. So I shouldn't say they're old, but basically they were well established. They had careers, they had families, and they had homes. They were established members of society, and we were just these little pipsqueak kids in college. And we had to do this whole hearing and all observe these formalities in front of them. Anyway, at that hearing, in front of a panel of all of these older sisters who were very well established and part of the national board of directors, the old sisters in the chapter, so now we're talking about the seniors and the super seniors in college, basically put me on the stand and had to make me look terrible in order to explain why they could blackball me or kick me out of the sorority. And I'll never forget the president of the chapter. She was a senior at the time. She said in front of all of these that there had to be 50 people in the room. And because it was such a dramatic thing, a lot of other sisters came just to watch, because it became quite the sort of internal spectacle. So there was more than 50 people that were present. And then I'll never forget, the president of the chapter said of me that the reason that I should no longer be part of the organization was because I was not an asset to the organization, and I would never amount to anything. And she talked about how I partied, how I always got drunk, and the way I dressed, how I was with boys, and basically just saying all of these things that made me, look really bad. And proved that I would never amount to anything. I would never be successful in life. And so I wasn't an asset to the organization, because I couldn't possibly be an asset to the organization with such a complete dearth and lack of skill sets and talents. And I exploded, and I was so angry at her and at everybody, and I really lashed out. I became a very angry person, and later on I did things I wasn't very proud of toward other people, because I was so angry that she would say something like that about me. And also in the article, I talked about how the hanged man represented both what happened to me and also represented saving grace. And it taught me a lot of lessons that were in the realm of wisdom. But that's not what I'm talking about here. Here I'm going to be talking specifically about power and shadow work. So I was angry at other people, and I was projecting that anger out and, acting out of that anger. It did take a while for me to sit down and realize why I was angry, why what she said matters. I'm like, who is she, right? If you think about it, why does her opinion on whether or not I would ever amount to anything in life matter? I guess it mattered because she struck a nerve. If I'm doing inner shadow work and I look deep down, at that age, I really didn't know whether or not I would ever amount to anything. And some of the choices I was making at the time did lead one to the reasonable conclusion that I could potentially, very possibly, not amount to anything ever. And so, the sorority and I parted ways. I transferred to another school. And anyway, I used that thing that she said as a source of power, actually. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So, I knew I wanted to become somebody. So I paid more attention to my academics. I decided to go on to law school. I worked really hard in law school. But it's hard to work hard, right? It's hard to have that determination. So, for example, on a morning when I didn't want to wake up, I didn't want to get up and study, I just want to stay in bed. What I would tell myself to get me out of bed, how I would motivate myself, was to remember what she said. And I would remember exactly how she said it, how, she is not an asset to this sorority because she will never amount to anything in life. And then just that pain, the pain of that insecurity turned into motivation and became a power for me because I knew I was going to amount to a lot. I knew I had to prove her wrong. So that in that moment, that sort of mundane, that little minuscule moment, it would get me out of bed. It would get me to class. If I didn't feel like studying, I would just remember what she said. Oh, I'll never amount to anything. And that would inspire me to study. And everything I did for a very long time, I know it's not the healthiest. And I'm sure somebody who has a psychology degree or who's a legitimate therapist can say that I didn't do it correctly. But you know what? Whatever I did, it got me to a place where I succeeded, and I succeeded exceptionally. I was able to go into one of the largest law firms in the entire world at a very young age. And then I became an in-house legal counsel at a Fortune 500 at a very young age. And I mean, I sound so braggy now, and I am bragging because I'm really happy that I did amount to something. But even in terms of, even within the context of lawyers, for somebody my age to have received, to be promoted the way I was promoted and the way I advanced very quickly, even in my legal career, it was exceptional, even among attorneys. And so I think I attribute that to the fact that anytime I felt lazy, anytime I felt like I just wanted to waste another minute of my life to just relax, I use that as fuel. I use that comment, oh, she'll never amount to anything, as fuel to fire me up and get me to do something and motivate me. I know that doesn't work for everybody. We are all different. And sometimes for people, when they're bullied like that, it makes them retreat even farther into their shell. For me, it did cause me to retreat farther into my shell for a long time. I wallowed in self-pity for a while, and then I realized instead of wallowing in self-pity and letting her win, I needed to use her own words against her, and I needed to use her words and turn that into my power rather than let her words disable me and render me powerless. So that's sort of one way how I used pain and transformed pain into power and into authoritative power, So she said something that took away my authoritative power, right? She said something that made it seem like I had no authority, I had no expertise, no skill sets, and would never amount to anything. So I used that to always propel me forward, to constantly work toward acquiring exactly what she said I had nothing of, and which was expert power, authoritative power, getting ahead in my career. And if you do read that article that I'd written, what I didn't even expect was how well that little, journey of mine worked, because ultimately the sorority, I was brought back into the sorority. They realized they had made a mistake, so they basically invited me back in. So I was back in the organization, but by that time I'd already graduated, so I was like, I guess I'll just be part of it, just to spite them, right? And that was step one. They couldn't believe I was back in, so that was enough spite already. But then the organization asked me to be their general counsel. The organization had a lot of issues, and so then I really helped them through legal issues, and then the entire the board of directors was quite grateful for a lot of the work that I had contributed. And that was more spite. And then the final sort of icing on the cake, or even the cherry on top, was when one of those sisters, it wasn't the one who said I would never amount to anything, but it was basically her best friend. So her best friend found herself in a lot of legal trouble. And at that time, I had already really risen in ranks in many aspects of my life and my career that was becoming recognized. And so she had no choice. And I knew she had no choice because there's no way, her pride would not have let her turn to me unless she had no choice. So she had to turn to me and ask me for legal help to help her on a personal matter. And that was when I realized I had attained authoritative power. I had gone from somebody trying to take away my authoritative power and basically succeeding because I didn't have any power of authority at that time, and transforming that pain and the anger that had been generated from that incident and transformed that pain into true authoritative power. And it was measurable authoritative power where, the ending of that story was the people who had brought me down came groveling in a way, asking and begging for help. Anyway, I've gone much too long on this very personal story, but it does lend itself to the subject matter of the class because it demonstrates how I transformed pain into power. In terms of accessing the powers of Earth or reward power, I want to share a story that family relatives like to tell about my mom, which I think does a great job demonstrating how even if you lack actual physical access to earth power, reward power, you can reach inward to drum up inner magic that can then associate, attract, and manifest actual physical access to earth power. Call it the law of attraction or call it witchcraft, I don't care. The vocabulary used for me isn't all that important. I actually just want to make it very clear, I don't know why, it's vanity, but I have no hair extensions in, okay? This is all real hair. This is naturally how thick and ridiculously crazy my hair is. So there are no hair extensions. I just have naturally very thick, long hair. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, I wanted to share the story about my mom. She's from Taiwan, southern part of Taiwan, and one of the poorest regions. Also, she grew up so poor that she knew literal hunger. Her family could go a day or two without food. It was that serious, which is why now whenever my sisters and I growing up would say, we're hungry, she would get really mad. Shadow work. She didn't do the right shadow work, but she'd get really mad and triggered and be like, that you're not hungry, you don't know what hunger is. And she'd get really pissed at us anytime we were like, we're so hungry, we're gonna die. She would get so pissed. So we knew to be more conscientious and mindful of how we use the word hunger around my mother. Anyway, sorry to sidetrack, but she was really poor, dirt poor, and there wasn't a single person in her family that was educated. Her parents only had, I think, like a grade school education. My maternal grandmother, she could read and write, but like Chinese is a really difficult language. So in the Chinese culture, she would have been considered illiterate. So she was illiterate, but not literally illiterate because she can read a couple of signs here and there. She can write anyway, my point is they were just very uneducated. And funny enough, my accent when I speak Mandarin has that same accent that the lower classes speak Mandarin with from Taiwan. So it's funny that that has carried over into the way I even speak Mandarin Chinese. Which is weird because there's a disconnect between how I look, how I comport myself, and then when I speak Chinese, they're like, wow, where did that come from? It's like somebody looking very British, but then when they open their mouth, they speak with like a Louisiana, very southern kind of accent, one of those very swampy accents. That's kind of what it's like. Anyway, so she was really poor, and if you're talking about privilege, she did not have access to earth power or reward power. It wasn't like she could, just work really hard. She was in those circumstances that the cycle of poverty really was perpetuated because the people in that neighborhood didn't have a way out. The one way that could get you out of the cycle of poverty were these national examinations that could get you into a better school system, get into a university that was really good. The problem with that is, as you know, here in the United States, with education, early childhood education is so important in terms of how it determines whether or not you can go on to the better schools. If you don't have that foundational privilege as a young child, it's really hard to pass these exams that can get you into the Harvard of Taiwan or the Yale and Stanford of Taiwan. So it's sort of like worked out by itself in terms of natural selection. Basically, all the wealthy people went to the Harvard of Taiwan, and the poor people kind of were stuck, and the poor and middle class were stuck in their situations. Hence, the cycle of poverty really was perpetuated. Somehow, my mother was the only person in her family, and it was attributed to the village in terms of her family really helped her. But to stay on story, the main point was she was able to get into a good school. But then even at the good school, these universities, at the time when she was living, social class was a big deal. It was very stratified in terms of socioeconomic class. So you didn't really intermingle or associate with people outside of your social class, even once you enter the university setting. And so, she would only be friends with and associate, even in the school, with the few people who were from her socioeconomic and regional status. She wouldn't have been able to really, associate with people who were of higher economic status or who were from the north. Anyway, my father's from the north. My father's actually from a very, very wealthy family. And so this is where we get into the funny stuff. So everybody, my father's side of the family, really think my mom performed some kind of like witchy thing, and my mom's relatives, when I go back to Taiwan, they joke about it as well. And then my sister who is not spiritual or religious in any way, isn't into any of this stuff at all, she would joke herself, and she says it, not me. She'll raise it. She'll be like, how did mom and dad get together? They're so different. And she believes, she's like, I think mom might have cast a spell on dad or something. And of course, we're all joking. There is true love there, blah blah blah. And my husband will say, oh, I think your mom's kind of a gold digger. Anyway, that just gives you a sense of how different it is. But the point I think I very poorly executed here is that, my mom didn't have access to external resources that would have been able to propel her into material prosperity. And the notion that someone from her background could then jump from where she was near the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder to the very top, literally effectively being married into the 1%, is impossible. But somehow she was able to achieve that. And there are lots of things you can talk about from the practical and reasonable logical standpoint, but it all really boils down to this. I mean, of course, it's determination, whatever you want to call it, but there is something magical there. Even if you don't believe in magic, there's this extra chutzpah, there's this extra something there. And that extra something is a form of power of manifestation. It's a form of summoning inward to find the reservoir of power that's inside of you, connected to the outside power, and then the two connect because you are connected to the collective unconscious, you're connected to the Akashic records, you are connected to the universe, that idea. If you can find that exact pulse point inside of you that relates directly to the pulse point in the universe related to that objective you seek to achieve, if you can achieve that power by association and then walk the line, you can access that outside universal energy. And that's how I believe truly she was able to launch herself outside of her socioeconomic circumstances. And a lot of people talk about, well, I'm stuck in the cycle of poverty. I don't have education. I don't have privilege. I don't have a means of getting out of my neighborhood. I can't pull myself up from my own bootstraps. And I do acknowledge that there are systemic issues that do make it impossible for certain communities to pull themselves out of the, from up from their bootstraps. And I think speaking on those terms on a political level is not, a productive conversation. But if we're talking about inner magic, I do think it becomes a very productive conversation to talk about magically pulling yourself up from your bootstraps. Magically speaking, I think there is something that can be done, which is a very different conversation. I do want to keep that clear. It's a very different conversation from systemic social injustice. There were systemic social injustices my mother faced, and those were problems a government or a political activist should absolutely tackle in the physical realm. But in terms of my mom, at her moment, in that space, in that specific individual case study, she couldn't wait for systemic change. And so there was something that she could do, which was magical. And it is, again, hinged entirely on your own power. How powerful are you to create change? And we all are born of equal power. I do believe we are all born with equal access to that inner power, because inside of you is every single pulse point to the universe, connected to the universe. It's just the strength of that connection, how well you can attune to that connection is, of course, unequal and different for each one of us. But you can level the playing field by using these forms of power cultivation that I hope I've been able to lay out in an organized, cohesive manner for this class. My personal experiences and observations are what led me to frame power and access to power in the way that I have for this course. And how I realized that the journey to activating inner reservoirs of power that then can become outer manifestations of success is going to be through something we refer to as shadow work. Shadow work is quite Buddhist, actually. In the story of the Buddha, before he could achieve nirvana or enlightenment, he had to face the Mara. Mara were outer manifestations of inner demons, and the specific demons that were said to have challenged the Buddha actually related to his far past, his past as a prince. It had to do with the hedonism he engaged in as a prince, and that's how the demons manifested when he was trying to attain spiritual ascension. So before he took on the journey of the Buddha, what he did in his early years were the manifestations of Mara he had to face. So it's interesting how the story of Buddha is basically shadow work, shadow work circa 500 BC. Yeah, I don't know why I felt the need to tell you that my hair is real and that there are no hair extensions. Probably, that relates to some shadow work that I have to do now that I finished this video. But no, seriously, I think it's just because everyone's always, oh, do you have hair extensions? I get asked that so often. Are you wearing hair extensions? Where do you buy your hair extensions? It looks so... Bitch, it's real. That's why it looks so real. Anyway, I'm sorry. Yeah, I have shadow work to do. Okay, after this video, I'm going to go do some inner journeying and figure out what lack mentality is causing me to tell you about my hair.